back. Day 28, New Start Discipleship. We're in Genesis 24 and 25 today. We're in the story of Isaac and Rebekah. So Isaac is Abraham's son, the son of promise, right? The son of Abraham's faith. And so God gave Abraham a son, Isaac, and we're going to read his story in Genesis 24, and the story of him going and pursuing and finding a wife, and a really interesting, fascinating cultural story there, and how God guided and directed the servant of Abraham. Then in Genesis 25, we read about the death of Abraham. So Abraham dies, and now Isaac is on his own to relate to this God who has made promises to his father. And so Isaac stays faithful to the Lord. But then we get into the next story, the next person. Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau, and God sovereignly says, instead of choosing to pass on the line through the oldest, so the line of the promise through the oldest son, I'm going to pass on the line of promise through the younger son. Jacob and Esau were twins, but Esau was born first. And so the promise, God says, I have chosen to pass on my promise through Jacob and not through Esau. Now this reveals God's sovereignty, that he chooses whatever pathway he wishes for his blessing. Now that doesn't mean that God chooses to take Jacob to heaven and chooses to send Jacob to heaven and send Esau to hell. What it means is that when God says, this is the way I want to bless, that we have to accept that. And if God says, rather than you doing right and you getting to earn your place in heaven, I want to grant that to you kindly by faith, then we just have to accept that that is true. And we have to receive that blessing from the Lord. And so then we're going to get to get to Jacob's story in chapter 32 and chapter 33 of Genesis. And I know we're running through some way faster and longer readings here. Stick with it, okay? These are powerful and amazing stories. In the story of Jacob, here's one of the things I want you to notice. Jacob was the son of promise, but he had a lot of issues, right? He was kind of deceptive. He was a deceiver and a liar, and a one who would manipulate and twist things for his own good and his own advantage. What are we supposed to say about that? Well, here's the thing. I know Jacob made a lot of mistakes, and some of them you'll read about. But there was something that set Jacob apart in this situation, and that is this: when you read that Jacob in chapter 32, he wrestled with God. Jacob had a heart that said, I want God's blessing upon my life. I want that. I need that. And he wrestled with the Lord. And I would just say that in your life and my life, we may have regrets of things that we did, but if we will wrestle with God and say, I need you, I want your salvation, I want your blessing, I know that I'm struggling with you right now and I'm wrestling through what you want me to do. But if we'll allow God to take our hearts and form them and break them away from the idols of this world and break them away from self and change our nature, God will do for us what he did for Jacob. And that is, he will not be ashamed to be called our God. One of the things that you'll see all the way through this book when you read it is that God reveals himself. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it'd be one thing if we were like, okay, so God's the God of Abraham. He's the God of men that have faith and trust God in difficult and impossible circumstances. Fine. And then we look at Isaac, and Isaac was a very peacemaking sort of man, a kind and gracious man. Okay, so we see that. But God's the God of Jacob? What about that, right? Like, what about the God, is he the God of the guy who didn't get it all right and who really messed some stuff up and had some real issues and was strong-willed and deceptive? Yeah, God's the God of that kind of guy too. If we'll wrestle with the Lord and allow our hearts to be conquered by Jesus, then God's not ashamed to be called your God either. You may have messed some stuff up in the past, and maybe even in this 26 days, 28 days that we've done so far, maybe you feel like it's coming back on you. God is not ashamed to be called your God if you'll trust in him. God bless you. See you tomorrow. Bye.